Добрый день. Добрый день. Мы начинаем
Hello.
презентацию
We start the presentation of new materials of Belarusian Economy Monitor. We are holding this event online today. Today we are having simultaneous interpretation in order to be the globe button at the bottom of Zoom.
We are starting the presentation of Belarus Economic Monitor, and in order to hear the translation in English, you have to find the sign of globe in the down of the screen and choose the English language.
Our first presentation is going to be on household surveys. Vilnius Panasevich will dwell on the autumn wave of the survey. Hello, thank you very much. Indeed, I'm going to dwell on the income and consumer confidence of households. Violeta? The microphone? Yes. I hope that you can hear me well. Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you. Then let us continue. This analysis is based on the survey wave organized in November 2024. Here we have city dwellers, and this is the general sample. As always, in this wave, we have the share of respondents who reported a decrease in income that have indicated the plateau. This is a share of about 26%. However, in this wave, the reasons for declining incomes have changed. In this wave, more respondents have said that this was because of higher prices and the exchange rate of the ruble to dollar. Now is the top second reason. However, if we remove the influence of the exchange rate of foreign currencies, then the share of respondents whose income declines grows to 32%. But if we purify this from the exchange rate influence and the price growth, those who are affected by reduced salaries, bonuses, and orders, this share goes down to 18.5%. And most often, these are dwellers of the Vitebsk region, and I would say from smaller towns of Vitebsk region, and entrepreneurs and self-employed people, as well as people with low income level, and those who read independent media, they always rate their income lower than those who read public media. If we ask respondents whose income declined, because we can see that we have different survey periods in Russia and in Belarus. However, in Russia, the survey periods in Russia and in Belarus. However, in Russia, the economic recovery has grown. The breaking the index of Belarus with the index has not changed. It has entered the positive share of the index. It is 0.4%. But in general, if we speak about the index in the EU, it is minus 12.6, and this gap is relatively high. The countries that continue being in the positive zone of the index is in the positive one. When people say that the financial standing of their family is better than the economic situation in the country, we decide to look at the gaps between those who evaluate the financial standing of their family and the economic situation in the country. The gap used to be quite high, but now we can see now this gap is the minimum. In November 2024, today, only 15% of respondents say that the financial standing of the is poor. Only 21% of respondents say that the economic situation of the country is poor. And 43% believe that the state of the economy is average. Then we asked about savings and spendings amid growing salaries. And in this survey wave, the share of those who prefer to spend more has reduced, but the majority of respondents either spend as much as before or more. However, this has not nudged the Belarusians to save more. The saving behavior is just like in the previous survey waves. They keep saving. However, 36% do not save at all. Next, we asked them what happens in the labor market. We can see the decrease in number of people who say that some of their acquaintances lost their jobs. 10% of respondents say that today. Maybe this is also because of seasonality, or for the last 2 years, this has been associated with a seasonality because in autumn, for an unknown reason, this share decreases. At the same time, the share of people who say that they observe lacking workforce in their sector is 56%. This is similar to the previous survey waves. In this survey wave, we decided to dive deeper to see what Belarusians do, whether they are satisfied with their employment, how they treat the issue of changing their job. So we asked the question to respondents who are the workforce, and it turns out that 52% of respondents work according to their educational background. More people work in the sector having higher education, and less people have no higher education. And if we speak about specialists and managerial positions and public sector workers, they are close to 60%. 46% of respondents say that their employment does not correspond to their educational background. It's a relatively high share. According to the survey in the EU, in 2024, the highest rate was in Finland. It was 41%. The minimum value was in Poland. It was 21%, which means that the average European Union value is about 28%, and in Belarus it is 46%. This is a significant difference. If we dive deeper and see who do not work according to their educational background, these are the people without higher education, and this is typical to non-qualified workers. Next, we decided to see, okay, if 46% respond that they do not work according to their educational background, what is your attitude to changing your employment? So for Belarusians, this is a normal process. 82% say they have ever changed their jobs, and only 18% have never changed their employment. It is clearly dependent on the age. The younger the person is, the more often the person will change employment because of the employment record, and employees of private enterprises change their jobs more often than those who work for state-owned enterprises. When asked, when was the last time when you changed your job, we would say that Belarusians do not really change their jobs, and especially this is dependent on the age. The younger the respondent is, the sooner this person would change employment, and people aged 54 to 45 to 54, about 44% of those changed their work 3 to 5 years ago, which means that young people are looking for jobs and new opportunities, and elderly people prefer keeping their current employment. Next, we decided to see the perception of the attitude of respondents of the society to changing jobs. We had an experiment. We asked the respondents to express their attitudes. So let's say there's Mikhail, aged 42, who comes to a job interview to an HR department. And this person is asked, you change your jobs quite often. we can see that you have not worked longer than a certain number of months in your previous job. And we asked respondents to describe what number of years or months would be considered a frequent job change. The majority of respondents say that quite often this is once a year or less 2 years and more. This is not a frequent job replacement. But if we speak about rare job change, then once in 5 to 9 to 10 and more years, this is considered to be a rare job replacement. So from 1 to 5 years is a normal period for changing jobs. Less than 1 year is not normal, and more than 5 years, this is a rare changing of jobs. And then we had a question about an attitude to those who prefer to work in one place. And the majority of respondents say it's good when people do not change their jobs. It's a positive signal, which means that this is a stable and reliable employee and devoted employee. However, this was mentioned by those who work for the state-owned sector. And in the private sector, people say that this is strange or this is a deficiency. And they also mock that people who work in one place for a long time, these are reliable and stable people. But in general, respondents positively perceive those who have never changed their jobs. Next, we decided to find out who would like to change a job. And it turns out that about 50% of all respondents would like to change their job. 32% of them would rather want that, and 18% are convinced that they should change their job. When we ask these respondents what should be the sector for your future employment, the majority of them would like to change their sector and not to stay in the same sphere. At the same time, women want to change their work more often than men, and among those who would like to change their job, as expected, we can see more people who have lower income. Next, we asked what would be the future sector or field of your employment, those who would like to change their jobs. And we can see arts, marketing, blogging, public activities. This is top 1. Top 2 is IT, followed by industry, construction, and transportation. Speaking of gender differences, then men and people aged 25 to 34 years old would like to work in IT more often, and women choose marketing. And people who are challenged to answer the question usually have general education, so they don't have any vocational training or any higher training or education. Speaking of what would you like to do? To be employed, to be a freelancer, or to be an entrepreneur? Among those who would like to change their job, 24% would like to become freelancers, would like to work for themselves, to be self-employed in order to be independent of employment issues. The next top answers are equal. These are employees in the private and public sectors, and only 11% would like to become entrepreneurs. And it is also important that 19% have difficulty answering this question, which means an uncertainty. And speaking about the breakdown between those who work for private and public enterprises, they would like to stay where they are employed. Those who work for state-owned enterprises would like to stay in the state-owned sector, and private sector employees would like to continue working in private sector. Next, we asked a question. What is the essence of your work? What do you do? What is your work about? Do you use any tools, arrangements, mechanisms, or instruments, or you work with computers, documents, like an office clerical job? And a quarter of respondents work with tools and instruments. 43% of respondents work with computers, documents, or abstracts, and 25% combine those two, and that women are more often employed as office employees, and men are often employed working with physical instruments and tools. And we can see a difference between those who have higher education and who do not. People with higher education work with computers, documents, and those who do not have higher education, as expected, they use tools more often. We also wanted to ask these people, who would you like to work? Uh, what work would you like to do in the future if you change your job? And those who work with computers and documents and abstracts would like to continue doing the same. They are generally satisfied with their type of work, with their job duties and responsibilities. 32% of them would like to combine these two types of activity, both physical work, including tools and materials, and computers. Speaking of those who work with physical instruments, 25% of respondents, their opinions differ. Half of them, 32%, would like to work with computers. They would like to fully change their type of job. And another half would like to work with uh, abstracts and computers. And if we speak about this category, then the 33% would like to work only with documents or in office, and 51% would like to combine two types of jobs. And now, speaking about the breakdown, ready to do physical labor are men and people aged 55 to 64 years. Computers are more liked by young people with high education and women, and to combine both types of jobs, this option is preferred by people aged 25 to 44 and by men. But all these wishes strongly depend on the category of respondents, but we can clearly see the trend that people would like to work with computers, documents more, rather than to do physical jobs. Next, we decided to find out among those who would like to change their jobs why they were not satisfied with their employment. And the financial factors are paramount. About half of respondents say that in the meantime, they either have low salaries or they can hardly see their wage growing. However, these factors do not really increase their desire to change their employment. So the people prefer to keep their area of activity. Then we decided to ask those who would like to change job whether they are active and proactive in replacing. And 59% look for jobs, but they are not proactive. And there's a difference between those who are confident they would like to change their job and those who think of changing their job. And about 30% of those who would like to change their job and who are confident about it, they are proactive, unlike those who are not confident that they need to change their jobs. And those who work half-time or those who have low income, they are more proactive in looking for jobs. Based on the reasons why people are not so proactive in looking for jobs, but they still say that they would like to find a new job, these people are not confident, or they say that there are no good offers, no good vacancies, or their employment contracts expire and they work for state-owned companies. And then, according to who believe that they need new skills and additional skills to change their job, we can see that this is one of the factors, one of the barriers when changing a job. The majority of respondents say that they really need new skills in order to either change their area of activity or their job in general. So women, as always, say that, well, in 90% of cases, say that they surely need to acquire new skills, and men mention this less often. And those who say that they need more skills, these are the people who would like to change the area of their activity, and those who would like to stay in the same area of activity. So in the survey, we have the Consumer Confidence Index, which, according to both methodologies, reaches 0%. Respondents still prefer to spend more than save, despite the fact that the desire to spend has reduced. The share of respondents reporting a reduction in income is plateauing at the rate of 26%, and 46% of respondents do not work in their specialty area. You can read a full bulletin on our website, and you will get more details on this survey. Thank you very much, and I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you. Olga, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Violeta. And right now, we are moving to the analysis of the macroeconomic situation, and I would like to ask questions in the chat of Zoom and YouTube. Please write in the chat about the sound quality. Can you hear us well from the studio? And now I'm passing the floor to Dmitry Kruk. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Just a second. Yes. So let me start with the resume. These are the key facts and trends that happened in Q3 2024. The first thing that I would like you to focus on is that for 5 or 6 quarters in a row, the consumption of households is the main growth driver. We cannot see significant changes here. We can see that this is the key trend in the Belarusian economy. Violeta has showcased fresher data. We report this survey data from Q3, and we can see that this trend continues. And the important macroeconomic diagnosis is that the domestic consumption growth is the main contributor to growth. However, net exports, though not critically, but becomes a donor with the negative sign.
Такой апдейт третьего квартала, то, что
An important update of Q3 is that the growth of investment in fixed assets has slowed down. We can see that this growth continues, but at a lower pace. And it's important, considering the plans for 2025, when they plan to put all stakes at investments in fixed assets as the main growth driver. Because today, household consumption is the main driver, and then fixed assets and investments in fixed assets will be the main driver of growth. Another important highlight is that there's a high likelihood. High likelihood means that the data enabling to diagnose this, we do not have this data. This data is not publicly available. Probably in Q3, there was a turbulence between the physical volumes of imports and exports. So there's a permanent problem in the system. External growth is very unstable. Next, these are the facts and data in interpretation. In Q2, we marked clear growth and the economy accelerated, and the majority of reasons and root causes nudged the economy to grow. And now we can see this is like weighing. We can see the arrows showing the factors that either slow down or accelerate growth. We can see top 3 factors in both. And the turbulences in the physical volumes of exports, this is an important factor. Today, this factor is not as significant as the domestic demand. However, in the last 2 years, we can see that this factor is clearly associated with the exports, and the export turbulences in Q3 was a critical factor for slowing down the entire economy. Therefore, lower investment growth that they try to prevent, and they try to nudge investments to grow. This is a significant element which slows down the growth. And the third factor, negative factor for growth, this is the weakening of the positive sectoral effects. In the first 2 quarters, agriculture contributed significantly to the growth, and consumer confidence was accelerated, and the trade indicated the growth, including wholesale and retail. And today, these sectoral effects have weakened. Speaking of the positive factors for growth, they are identical to what we could see in the last 1.5 years. And the most important diagnostic mean is the statement that entering the phase of slowing down of the growth is expected and explainable. And in our presentations in Q4 of 2023, we mentioned that all the signs of the economic slowdown were present. However, in the first half of the year, the economic growth in Russia and in Belarus had a different trend, but today we can see that the overheated economy starts slowing down. At the same time, there can be the following problem. The authorities would like to keep high growth rates, and this expects that within the next few quarters, this will be the trend in 2025. And now, speaking about figures, these are the images explaining my statements. GDP exceeded the historical peak value if we look at the curve. However, the pace of growth has decreased. Blue bars are at the moment speed of the economy, as we say. After idling in Q4, the economy gathered momentum for 2 quarters, and now we can see that the slowdown of the economy dominates on the economy for the last 2 quarters. This is another important thing. Domestic demand is a clear factor for accelerating the economy and the entire cycle, but for a few exceptions of growth in the last 1.5 years is explained only by domestic demand. Speaking of external demand, we cannot see a dramatic decrease, but if domestic demand continues being supported, then certainly we can expect that net export demand will be a threat to macroeconomic stability of the country. Speaking of the components, this situation is identical to a few previous quarters when we can see red bars. This is the household consumption, and this shows the entire economy. And we can see yellow bars. This is the contribution of the growth of investments in fixed assets. We could see that in Q2 it accelerated, and in Q3 investments grew, but the phase of growth has changed. It has been weakening. And now the graph showing us this picture for the last year. It is important because of the levels. Real salary skyrockets, and then it toes to the unknown, the consumption of households, and this becomes the key driver for output growth. We can see that average salary and GDP and their growth rates significantly exceed the average rates in the economy. And Mid-term projections for the macroeconomic stability are as follows. We can see how individual components behave, whether they are balanced. We can see that the trend continues, and the trend is that the household consumption continues growing. However, fixed assets accumulations grow in steps, which means that the share of household consumption prevails in the economy. So this means that the economy is overheated as far as this component is concerned. I mean, household consumption. Now, speaking of the external position,
данные доступны со знаком вопрос.
we do not have all the data because the data are not available. But generally, if we look at what we can see available, if we look at the price indices in external trade, then I would like to say that we can get information from Belstat as for September. But if we look at the situation until August, then the situation with the balance of foreign trade in nominal terms was relatively stable. However, behind this visible stability, if we consider our previous statements and some bits and pieces of data on pricing for goods and services, we can look at the indices of pricing and the balance of foreign trade. And here we can see significant jumps in physical volumes and price indices. In this chart, you can see price indices indicating that in Q3 there was a decline. However, if we compare this with the physical component and pricing component, we can see that there are prerequisites to expect that there was a significant decline in physical volumes of imports and exports in Q3. I believe that this is a big news, and this is one of the key issues on the agenda of Q3, one of the background events that explained the negative trends in the output that we could see. And then the foreign trade landscape is as follows. Here we can see the blue and green buttons that go up. These are price indices and physical volumes, like the blue ball and the green diamond. These are imports. So we can see that the prices and physical volumes have gapped, and we can see this trend is clearly seen here. And behind this trend, we can see a clear problem, because there's a gap between the price indices that we use here and the physical volumes. And there's an important thing. Let me get back. The prices for exports and prices for imports grew. However, the export prices grew to a large extent, and the weakening of the real efficient exchange rate enabled to improve the situation of the foreign price competitiveness. The blue bar is the index of price competitiveness, which combines the terms and conditions for trade, the prices for imports and exports, and the influence of the real effective exchange rate, which means that the external pricing environment has improved for Belarusian producers. For the previous 3 quarters, it improved lightly, but mostly it was on hold, and now we can see that the situation is better than the historically average. If we look at 2018 and 19, which can be considered a average historical norm. And today, speaking of the price competitiveness, this situation is better than the average historical value. Now, I would like to mention the following trend behind the improvement of the real effective exchange rate in Q3. We could see that it was a situation of the that has changed. This is a new trend, but in general, we do not see this in average figures for the quarter. But we can see this in the monthly breakdown. We cannot be sure that this trend is stable. It largely depends on the dynamics of the Russian ruble, but let me get back. The improvement of the pricing condition cannot be guaranteed. A real effective exchange rate in Q3 improved the situation, but it is very likely that in Q4 this situation will roll back. And now, speaking of the sectoral impacts, the key growth donors from the viewpoint of sectors were as follows. We can see some change. The orange or yellow, well, probably let's call it a yellow curve. Yellow is trade. Trade was the key sectoral growth driver in the previous periods, and now we can see that for the last couple of quarters, trade has slowed down. And if we look at the figures quarter on quarter, we can see that this is out of the list of the key donors of growth. Today, we can see that traditionally processing industry is the main growth driver. It is light blue, and construction. Investments, despite all the turbulences, still grow, and this created conditions for recovery of the construction sector, and there's a fixed trend of pushing information and communications. This sector gathers momentum very slowly, but we can say that in this sector, the bottom line has been reached, and there are no prerequisites for continued decline. And this diagnostics shows that this sector can be considered as one of the growth drivers. And there's another thesis that we have been repeating for a few years in a row, that the acceleration of growth happens amid macroeconomic disproportions. These are the statements that repeat from quarter to quarter. I will not repeat them again. And there are small changes if compared to the previous quarter. And I would say that the general landscape is unchanged. The desire to continue this growth in the economy, which is overheated, and if we try to accelerate and overheat this economy even more, then the macroeconomic disproportions will grow as well. And then as we can see, that the overheated salaries and real cost of labor have reached their historical peaks. In 2013, it was the same situation. Then it translated into a long period of slowing salaries down. Today, the situation is different. The structural deficit of labor in the labor market does not allow us to compare this with 2014 or 13. However, salaries that are high hit industries, and we can see the real cost for labor. And we can see that this is a medical fact, that this is this is a factor that is significant.
Zoom есть? Ага. Так, Да, я вот этим слайдом завершу. Значит, ну, я уже вот в самом начале
Let this
анонсировал.
be the final slide in this presentation. Anatoly will provide more details on that, but in general, speaking of 2025, I would say that if we look at this situation through the optics of next year, then the main conflict, the main history will be as follows. If the economy is not accelerated artificially, if the economy is allowed to reach equilibrium, if the stimuli that exist are not longer supported and the economy reaches its equilibrium, then we can say that the baseline scenario is that the growth will slow down and overheating would evaporate, and these market disproportions would still be relevant, but they would not be a threat to the financial turbulence. Therefore, the prerequisites that were there, they will still be there, and they will make the economy not growing that fast. However, the authorities might have different plans for next year, and the forecast of macroeconomic development for next year says that the economy will be pushed to grow, and the key scenarios will be to replace household consumption as the key driver of growth, to replace this by the investment in fixed capital, fixed assets. Will this scenario materialize? I would say no, rather than yes. They will not get the figures that they would like to see. But at the beginning of this year, we had a similar discussion whether the authorities can implement their plans that were not realistic at the beginning of the year. And the key answer was no, but for many disclaimers. And I would like to mention the potential factors that might potentially, even in the overheated economy, to fuel growth by accelerating macroeconomic disproportions. Yes, despite the macroeconomic logic, but these things have to be recognizable. And speaking of the leading positions, can be directive lending with the imports and investments, and this can be a potential reserve. And then the economy that goes down can be adjusted for some period, and then it can show growth. But this does not mean that this will happen. This is a matter for discussion. These are just the hypotheses, and the key scenario that we can see is what Anatoly is going to dwell about. Thank you. Thank you. And our next presentation is going to be about inflation and the monetary environment. Anatoly Kharitonchik is our next presenter, and we are waiting for your questions in Zoom and YouTube, and we will answer your questions after we finish this presentation. Thank you, Olga. If we provide a summary, then we can say that the economy of Belarus in Q3 was seriously overheated, and that the problem of labor market deficit progressed. So the economic conditions created an environment for rising costs and for maintaining an increased inflationary pressure. However, inflation slowed down in Q3 thanks to preserving the price control exercised by the authorities and the conservative approach by the authorities to growing regulated prices and tariffs. That the authorities responded to the record-breaking overheating of the economy using non-conventional methods. The fiscal policy remains stimulative, and monetary conditions have become close to neutral but not restrictive due to the weaknesses. And the budget stimuli will be provided by the National Bank, and the National Bank will maintain its interest rates close to neutral level using various tools, so the economy will continue operating in the environment of excessive demand. And if there are no significant shocks, the economy will slow down and the inflationary pressure will remain elevated, and price growth will accelerate from 5 to 6% in 2024 to 6 or 8% in 2025. So, as I said, inflation in Q3 slowed down. Now it is 4.9%. This is the analyzed growth per quarter, seasonally adjusted. This is the analyzed growth per quarter. It shows at the moment price impulse in the corresponding quarter. In Q2, it was 6%. So this slowdown happened, and this was because of the base inflation. And speaking of the core inflation, and in case of non-core inflation, the authorities did not want to grow regulated prices, and their quarterly growth significantly slowed. Base inflation was about 5% in annual terms, and in the current economic situation, this base inflation or core inflation is relatively low. And this low core inflation is explained by the influence of price controls that slowed and limited the transfer of increased pro-inflationary pressure into consumer prices, especially for non-foods. At the same time, inflation in non-regulated services remained high, and in Q3, it was about 6.5% in annual terms. And if we exclude the influence of directive change of attitude starting from July 1st on setting the terms for medical services, then we can see that it was about 8% in annual terms, annualized terms, which was relatively high. And the consumer services grow by 10% per month in annualized terms.
Это вы видите на левом графике. Он в сентябре уже более чем на 5% превышал уровень.
In September, exceeded by more than 5% the prices for non-foods. So there was a significant gap between non-regulated prices, which means that the inflationary overhang has accelerated. So without price controls, price inflation in September would not be 6%, but 10.5%. You can see this on the right-hand graph. And now the price control, as said, has slowed down the transformation of the dominating pro-inflationary factors, which means the price growth and the pro-inflationary pressure continued, both due to domestic and foreign factors. And the key foreign factor was accelerated inflation in Russia. It accelerated even more in Q3. It exceeded 10% in annualized terms. And on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a significant gap between inflation in Russia and in Belarus. This is a threat to price stability in Belarus in mid-terms. In Q3, pro-inflationary influence from the Russian market, on the left-hand side, we can see this better, has been affected by the dynamic of the exchange rate of the Belarusian ruble, which in recent months has strengthened if compared to the Russian ruble. amid the record-breaking offering of the foreign currency in the Belarusian market. If we remove seasonality, if it is seasonally adjusted, then it exceeded the previously seen volumes, and disparity of prices in the Russian and Belarusian markets has not changed significantly, but for dairy products, where it grew and the exchange rate of the Belarusian ruble remained close to the equilibrium level. It was undervaluated, and this undervaluation was about 1.3% in Q3. As I said, the foreign currency market operated in the environment of strong relative influence, but this is not stable. This net offering is shaped by the sales of foreign currency by households, which is record-breaking since 2016, and in September and in October, these figures were very high. Probably these behavior of households in an environment of high income growth, including high demand for real estate and high input of rubles in deposits in banks, and the reduced stimuli to save in foreign currencies because of sanctions caused this situation. And the net offering of the foreign currency from the population explains what happens in case of firms. You can see a green bar. The net offerings of enterprises of offerings of foreign currency was close to the figures of Q2, and this was the record-breaking demand since 2022. In 2022-2023, the net demand for foreign currency was compensated by the sales from non-respondents, probably because of re-engineered supply chains and financing chains. In Q3, this has no longer been seen, and this is the sequence of the balancing of the imports and exports, and the slowdown in getting revenues from foreign markets. In this situation, we do not believe that this situation is stable. In foreign currency, we can see the overheating of the Russian economy, which causes extended exports, and this overheats Belarusian economy, and then the Belarusian economy imports more. And if monetary authorities, fiscal authorities of Belarus make attempts to weaken demand, and at the same time, Belarusian authorities stimulated domestic demand, and the Belarusian economy was overheated in Q3. The output gap, the deviation of potential GDP and the level that would not cause macroeconomic disbalances is evaluated at the range of 3.2% in Q3, and this is a significant scale of excessive demand, which means the continued pressure on costs of producers and consumer prices. At that, we should say that this scale of overheating of the economy, which can be seen on the left-hand side, is record-breaking. It was record-breaking since 2014, but this does not mean that the economy should fall down immediately and fall into the abyss, which means that the vulnerability to shocks has increased, and sustaining high growth rates becomes complicated. And these growth rates are not natural and stable. And now, in an environment of high demand for goods and services, there was a significant growth, demand growth for workers, and the and the deficit of workers has increased. The unemployment rate is 2.95% only in Q3, seasonally adjusted. It was less than one unemployed per one vacancy. And as a result, firms increased salaries. Real salaries grew at a very high rate. And in August and September, if seasonally adjusted, we can see it was growing at a rate of 0.8% a month in real terms. And salaries has already exceeded the inflationary neutral level. So the pricing pressure from the labor market has increased in Q3. And that the Belarusian authorities continued not to recognize overheating of the economy, and they did not respond to it in a needed way. High growth of salaries and the budget expenditures were the key factors of sustaining excessive demand in the economy, which is seen on the left-hand side. And based on the public data, we can evaluate the real growth of expenses in the consolidated budget. It was about 15%, if not more, to the average value in
Рост и объем расходов сейчас
2022. It was a significant growth. And today we can see that it exceeds the balanced level. However, this balanced level is higher than before because a significant share of financing provided by international financing institutions was gone, and the state budget had to pay for all these things. And you can see that there were various factors to support excessive demand, and this contribution has been going down. The National Bank in Q3 increased the interest rates on loans and deposits, and the overnight interest rates increased by 0.5%, and the market deposits and credits, the interest rates became neutral to the economic activity. Still, they were not a significant restrictor, and they sustained the favorable conditions for firms and households in terms of satisfying their demand for credit. And non-pricing terms for lending, like eligibility requirements, etc., remained being soft. Why? Because increasing the reserving norms in foreign currency was not an efficient tool. This measure allowed to remove about $500 million of excess liquidity from the banking system, and at the same time, the National Bank in Q3 issued more money by buying government bonds by more than 1.3 billion Belarusian rubles and by more than 2.1 billion Belarusian rubles by buying foreign currency in the foreign exchange. So the banking system continued operating in an environment of excessive liquidity, and in the last months it started growing. And since the auction operations of regulating liquidity by the National Bank were not exercised, the interbank interest rate was about 5% in nominal terms. So in real terms, it was negative, and it was lower than the inflation neutral level. So the demand for credit was relatively high in Q3, and the supply of the banks was not limited. Ultimately, the credit activity remained high, so the scope of new lending in Q3 reached its peak value. It is 77% to GDP. This is the indicator. So new credits generate new output, and this matches the business cycle, the indicator of output gap. Speaking of NPLs, this is the right-hand side. We can see that non-performing loans also grew in Q3, but their ratio to GDP just recovered to the values of 2017 and 18. And 2019, however, this indicator is not related to the economic cycle. This is seen in the study made by the National Bank, and the economic cycle and the attitude of the banks have influenced that. So credits grow faster than GDP, and the volume of money issued is also higher than the GDP growth. So issuing of credits can mean that there's an expansion in the economy. The accumulated scope of the inflationary overhang and the scale of overheating of the economy suggests that the economy should get tougher, but this is very unlikely because of the institutional weakness of the National Bank. It will likely
нейтральных уровней ставка рефинансирования
probably keep the refinancing rate of 9.5%. However, I would not exclude the likelihood of its growth in the second half year if the inflation risks emerge. The fiscal policy based on the budget projections will be stimulating, but the scope of this stimuli will get smaller, and the fiscal policy and the economic policy will be moderately soft and loose, and this will slow down the return of the overheated economy to the balanced state. So this economy will cool down at a modest pace, so the economy will continue operating in an environment of excessive demand. However, this may go down as stimuli go down, both internal and external, and GDP will slow down because of a number of limiters. First of all, this is the expected slowdown of the economy in Russia, where the economic conditions become tougher. And second, the production capacity is fully loaded, and the labor shortage limit the growth of GDP. So this year, the growth of GDP can be at the rate of 4.4%, and next year this will be about 1.5%. Accelerated level of imports will maintain, and this will be less favorable if the growth dynamics in Russia slows down. And in general, the production capacity has been fully loaded already, so the exports will see some limitations. We will see the deficit of foreign trade in goods and services close to 0 up to 2% of GDP, which will be weakening for the Belarusian rubles. And if there are no significant shocks, then we can expect that the weakening of the Belarusian ruble will be 4 to 6%. And speaking of the deficit of labor, pro-inflationary factors and constant adaptation to sanctions, they will sustain pro-inflationary pressure next year. However, this translation into prices will limited by price controls. However, next year, price controls will get weaker in order not to drop production volumes and in order not to worsen the financial standing of enterprises. So the financial pressure will translate into prices, and the core scenario that this inflation will be not 4 to 6% this year, but next year this will be 6 to 8%. So the risks of deviation from the baseline forecast are high due to the fragility of the overheated Belarusian economy, and Dmitry has already dwelled on the factors of uncertainties. In general, this combination of economy overheating and price controls and the subordinate position of the national bank to the government, which means it is not free in its actions. All of these things increase the
мягкая экономическая политика внутренняя будет продолжаться
vulnerability to external shocks.
В России произойдет значительное ухудшение.
Domestic. And what if high inflation happens in Russia? Then there can be hard landing. There will be a higher risk of facing the same situation like we had in 2015 and 16. The second risk is as follows. I'm not confident about the growth of potential GDP in Belarus. I can expect that temporarily this can be 2% a year or even more. In this environment of transformation of the Belarusian economy and the economy in Russia, if this hypothesis is true, then the space for growth will be higher if compared to the core scenario or baseline scenario. And if the inflationary pressure is higher, then this can be different. But I'm still convinced that even if there's an acceleration of growth, then this is a temporary thing, because neither political nor economic institutions nor the values of the society contribute to sustainable and high growth of the economy. Thank you. Thank you, Anatoly. We have a few questions. They were asked during registration. Let me voice them. First of all, distinguished presenters, are you sure about the statistical figures provided by government authorities? I'm very concerned about that, because I have to use public information as well. I can start answering this. I have no reason not to trust formal statistical information by the authorities. In general, falsifying this information is almost impossible, in my view, unless everything is hidden and only a few figures are disclosed, because changes in any sectors of the economy, in any report, will affect hundreds, if not thousands, of other indicators in other reports. And it seems to me this is a relatively difficult thing and labor-intensive thing to draw some figures. This will be revealed quite often, and the macro dynamic is quite coordinated, and it coordinates with the population surveys that we organize. I would add a few more words. I fully agree with the general idea by Anatoly that we cannot expect any systemic disturbance. Sensitive statistics on foreign trade is simply classified. So if it were easier for them to provide the falsified figures, then they would do it, but they simply close the statistics. But a number of indicators lose their economic sense. If we take the banking statistics on NPLs, considering that there are so many peculiarities of calculating NPLs and estimating this NPL indicator cannot be falsified. It makes no sense to do that. Speaking of the financial health status of firms, all the financial indicators are based on the national reporting standards, and there are many things that will provide disturbances, and we have to understand that. So these are not intentional disturbances, but these are the standards that are quite specific. Therefore, the statistics based on them does not always answer our questions. One of the examples is that there's the indicator of registered unemployed people. Whether this is true or not, whether it makes sense to look at this indicator. No, this indicator is not indicative. Another question asked at the registration phase: what is the situation with the IT sector, and what is the forecast for 2025, and what is the situation about trade? Speaking of the trade, compared to 2019, 2020, the exports of Belarusian goods to the EU has reduced. It fell by 60 to 70%. And the key things that are still supplied are fertilizers, mixed fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers, rapeseed oil, furniture, and a number of industrial products. And speaking of imports from the EU to Belarus, the imports have been growing by 20% of 2024 in prices. And here we can see this is about vehicles, cars are responsible for about 40% of imports, and then these cars are taken to Russia. This is not falsified statistics, but these are methodological issues. We can see a significant import from non-CIS markets, and in the GDP and in the trade balance, we can see significant statistical mismatches. So these imported goods are brought into Belarus and then they are exported to Russia, but this is not really portrayed in the statistics. We should be aware of that. So there are things that are like that. In addition, lots of industrial goods and pharma products are imported. However, after the latest sanctions, the dynamics will slow down and the imports will not get to Belarus from Europe directly, but through intermediary countries. Thank you. And now the question is from Zoom. There's a quote by Snapkov dated October 23rd, 2024. Salary costs grow as well as other costs. The share is 22% to costs, which means that we do not have excessively paid salaries. Dmitry, does this correspond with your data, or you have different data sources, you and the Vice Prime Minister? First of all, we speak about various indicators, and I dare to say that my aggregated indicator, like real aggregated costs of labor, they allow us to see the gap between the costs and costs for labor. But if we see this quote, we can see that this indicator that they refer to, this is about salaries, but the real salary burden grows and Stopko probably has more details on that, but the share in the expenses, in the costs, and considering that salaries are one of the components, one of the key components in all sectors, then salaries growth will exceed all other costs. In some sectors, the share of salaries has not increased. Well, maybe this is a good news for some of the sectors, but systemically speaking, if we look at the 2-year trend, if we take the indicator that Snapkov refers to, the share of costs, well, this has increased. It depends on what period they refer to. So I do not see any significant great news. It's like an attempt to say there is no problem, however, the problem is evident. Salaries create excessive financial burden for enterprises. I just want to say a few more words, just a few more figures on top to what Dmitry said. Distinguished Vice Prime Minister forgot to mention that not all salaries grow by 17 to 18% if we, but this is the average figure, and this is a lot. And if salaries grow faster than other costs, therefore the pressure is significant. It was not in the question, but also the Vice Prime Minister said that our salaries grow. Like in Russia, there's no significant difference between them, and it seems to me that this is an argument to acknowledge overheating, because in Russia they acknowledge overheating. Everybody does that. Nabiulina says that this situation is record-breaking since 2017. The key interest rates refinancing rate in Russia is 2 times higher than in Belarus. Can this be threatening to the Belarusian economy? In the condition of vacuum, in an environment of vacuum, you say? Okay, good. Thank you for your question. Right now, we can see that the monetary fiscal policy in Belarus and in Russia are synchronized. Yes, this can be threatening because it is more financially interesting to invest in Russia, and then there is a carry trade.
В том числе, возможно, пытаться и российские фирмы.
So probably firms, Belarusian firms and Russian firms will borrow in Belarus, and they will deposit this money in Russia because of higher interest rates. And there's a more significant risk, macroeconomic risk, if this economy of the central bank of Russia, if the growth in Russia weakens, then this will be a negative impact on the exports of Belarusian goods. And Belarus has a neutral monetary policy, not limiting monetary policy. So the demand remains high, and demand for imports remains high. There's a significant risk that the deficit in foreign trade may expand. Therefore, the National Bank realizes that, I believe, and certainly I wish they provided more communication in this regard. Thank you. Our next question is to Violeta. Why people are positive? They are happy about growing salaries and expanding credit, and they don't think the situation will change, or are there different reasons? Yes, thank you for the question. It seems to me that all colleagues have already said that we can observe overheated demand. People evaluate the status of the economy and what's going on through their financial standing. We know that from the previous survey wave, when we asked people about their assessment of their financial standing, and And people are very positive today about the financial standing of the economy. This is the highest figure compared to the previous survey waves. If we add salary growth, but we do not see them speaking about that directly, but this is mentioned indirectly because we can see a small share of people or getting smaller share of people who say that they see their salaries decreasing, and we can see availability of credit, etc. So people are really positive about the situation, the current situation. Today, they have less expectations about the future, but the current situation is perceived by them as more positive than it was a couple of years ago. Colleagues, will you take the floor? Thank you. Our next question is, next year, 15 billion rubles will have to be repaid as the public debt, which is 30% of the national budget. And do you see any risks about that? And will the ruble repayment scheme by the Ministry of Finance help? Well, the risks are there, of course.
Там 10 около это погашение основного
These
долга.
repayments are significant. 10% is the servicing of the debt, and the rest of it is interest, and it is expected to refinance this, and there are political risks. In the baseline scenario, I would assess those risks as low, or chances as low. I don't think that this debt will be refinanced, and the budget plan presented by the government, as for me, I believe this is a relatively balanced plan. In terms of income, it is even conservative, so I do not see any problem in the deficit that is expected there. They plan to bridge this by the assets at the disposal of the government, and the government has enough Belarusian rubles. Well, 10% of the budget revenue is donations from foreign states like Russia, but these are political risks, I would say. It is hard to forecast them, but the baseline scenario says that this will stay within the boundaries of this plan. There's another thing. If we compare the actual figures and plan figures, then we can see that the Ministry of Finance always targets to the maximum things, but still there's a situation when Russia can extend these borrowings, and this will continue. So the budgets of 2022, 2023, and the 2024, we can look at them and we can see that the figures may not correspond to the actual figures, and probably they have installed various safeguards. And the last question, it goes to the third speaker. If the overheating does not lead to falling, then why is it negative? Because people live better. Well, it's good that people live better, but the problem is that, as said, the vulnerability of the economy to shocks has increased. Any significant shock, especially in the foreign environment, we will be able to see the abyss in which we can fall. Look at 2012, 13, 14, when the economy was constantly overheated. It was about 5%. It was higher than today. It was never lower than 2.8%. And all of these things were great until the oil prices went down, and then the sanctions were introduced against Russia. And then the Russian economy started slowing down and experiencing a fall down. So considering the mistaken policy of tying the Belarusian ruble to the US dollar, it required adjustments, and the consumption of households was falling for 2 years in a row. And we were never back to the level of investment that we had back then. So such overheating means that such overheating means that these risks are there and they significantly increase. Thank you. Thank you all who attended our event today. Thank you, our distinguished presenters. I can see no more questions, so see you in the future. Thank you and goodbye.